Welcome back. The year was 1503, in the small town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, France, a place of quiet hills and plague-haunted streets. From this world of superstition and suffering came a boy named Michel de Nostradamus, who would grow into one of history's most mysterious figures, Nostradamus. Centuries later, his name still echoes whenever the world trembles, whispered in newsrooms, documentaries, and late-night conversations about fate. But before he became a prophet wrapped in legend, he was simply a man of learning. Born into a Jewish family that had converted to Christianity, young Michel grew up surrounded by books instead of miracles. He studied medicine at the University of Montpellier, where he earned a reputation for his calmness during outbreaks of the plague, mixing herbal remedies, cleanliness, and logic at a time when others clung to prayers and charms. This balance between reason and mysticism would define his life. He was a man of contradictions, a scientist who studied the stars, a skeptic who wrote of destiny. The Europe he lived in was chaotic wars, famines, religious fear, and people longed for signs of what was coming. Nostradamus understood this hunger. He watched the heavens and the patterns of history, believing that cycles repeated and human behavior followed rhythms just like the planets. Out of this conviction, he began to write. What emerged was Les Prophéties, published in 1555, a strange poetic collection of quatrains that blurred the line between poetry and prediction. He wrote in riddles, switching languages midline, masking meaning behind symbols. Some say this was to hide his ideas from the Inquisition. Others believe it was his way of making the future timeless, free from any single interpretation. Whatever his reason, those verses would outlive him by centuries. Whether seen as prophecy or puzzle, they turned Michel de Nostradamus into something more than a scholar. He became the voice of humanity's oldest obsession. The need to believe that someone, somewhere, has already seen what awaits us beyond the veil of tomorrow. And so, our story begins not with magic, but with curiosity. A man, a quill, and the quiet question that never dies: can we truly read the future, or only ourselves? When Nostradamus published Les Prophéties, he had no idea he was creating one of the most enduring mysteries in literary history. The book was a collection of more than 900 short poems, or quatrains, each just 4 lines long. Yet within those brief verses, he managed to build an entire mythology, one that still captures imaginations nearly 500 years later. The structure of Les Prophéties was unlike anything of its time. It was not a story or a diary. It was a cryptic mosaic of words, jumping between languages: Old, French, Latin, Greek, even bits of Italian. The lines described wars, natural disasters, kings' deaths, and strange omens in the sky. But nothing was ever named directly. Instead of France, he might say the Western Kingdom. Instead of a king, he would write the lion. His world was one of codes, metaphors, and layers, as if he wanted the reader to do the work of uncovering meaning. Some historians suggest that Nostradamus wrote this way to protect himself. The 16th century was not kind to those accused of heresy or sorcery, and speaking too directly about the future could be seen as challenging divine order. By hiding behind poetic language, he could claim that his verses were merely reflections, not revelations. Others believe his vagueness was deliberate, that he understood the power of ambiguity. A phrase left open can travel farther through time than a sentence that nails itself to a single date. When Les Prophéties first appeared, it spread quickly among the nobility and scholars of Europe. Queen Catherine de' Medici wife of France's King Henry II, became one of his admirers, even inviting him to court. She was said to be fascinated and a little afraid of his predictions. The moment her husband's death seemed to match one of Nostradamus's quatrains, the myth took root that he could see what no one else could. From that point forward, Les Prophéties stopped being just a book. It became a mirror one, in which every generation saw its own fears reflected back. Whether through war, plague, or revolution, people turned to those pages, hoping to find an answer that had been written long before their time. If Les Prophéties was the body, then Nostradamus's writing style was its heartbeat, rhythmic, obscure, and strangely alive across centuries. His quatrains read like riddles carved in fog. They are full of contradictions, precise dates beside vague imagery, celestial movements next to political turmoil. To read him is to wander between clarity and confusion by design. He rarely spoke plainly. Instead of saying a city will fall, he would write, "Fire from the sky shall strike the great one." The power of that phrasing lies in its elasticity. Centuries later, readers could map those words onto almost any tragedy: a burning tower, a bombing, a revolution. Nostradamus left enough space for history to crawl in and make itself at home. Some saw that as poetic genius. Others saw a calculated trick, a linguistic sleight of hand meant to keep his words relevant forever. Even the shifting between languages served a purpose. It blurred meaning just enough to make translation itself an act of interpretation. Every reader, in every age, could project their own fears into his lines. And yet, beyond the mystique, there is a trace of empathy in the way he wrote. He did not predict joy or triumph, mostly chaos, loss, and change. His verses sound less like curses and more like warnings whispered by someone who had seen too much suffering in his dark lifetime. After all, Nostradamus had lived through war and plague. He knew how fragile life was and how desperate people were for signs of control. By turning fear into poetry, he gave it shape, and by keeping his language fluid, he made sure his voice would never truly fade, always shifting, always fitting whatever story the world told next. After the first edition of Les Prophéties spread through France, something strange happened. People began reading history into his poetry, not after it happened, but as it unfolded. When a plague returned or a royal court faced turmoil, someone would inevitably find a verse that seemed to describe it. Nostradamus had become more than a writer. He was now a vessel for collective anxiety. One of the first great confirmations came with the death of King Henry II. A quatrain spoke of a young lion defeating the old one in combat, their eyes pierced through a golden cage. When the king was fatally injured in a jousting tournament, struck through the visor by a splintered lance, people gasped. The connection was not exact, but it felt close enough that emotional fit mattered more than precision. From then on, believers began mapping his words to every major upheaval: the rise of Napoleon, the fires of London, the wars of Hitler. All were said to have been written centuries before in those cryptic lines. Even modern events like the 9/11 attacks or pandemics have been tied, however loosely, to his quatrains. For many, he became proof that the future was already scripted, waiting to be decoded. But this fascination says as much about humanity as it does about Nostradamus. We want patterns. We crave the comfort of believing that chaos has been anticipated. His poetry gave people a framework for that, not a promise of accuracy, but a mirror reflecting their fears back at them in poetic form. Over the centuries, his name turned into shorthand for seer. His books were reprinted, reinterpreted, even commercialized. What began as one man's intellectual curiosity had evolved into a cultural phenomenon, a reminder that sometimes belief itself is the most powerful prediction of all. For every believer who swore by Nostradamus's foresight, there was a skeptic ready to dismantle it. Scholars, linguists, and historians have long argued that the man's true skill was not in seeing the future. It was in writing sentences so flexible that they could survive any age. To them, Les Prophéties is not divine revelation, but linguistic camouflage. The trick lies in how the human mind works. When faced with a vague riddle, people instinctively fill in the blanks. A phrase like fire in the great city can apply to a medieval siege, a bomb, or a building collapse. The words do not predict, they adapt. This is what psychologists later called retrofitting matching events to predictions after they occur. Critics also point out how much translation distorts his meaning. Nostradamus wrote in 16th century French, peppered with Latin and Greek idioms, so every translator makes choices that subtly shift interpretation. A single word lion, king, or mountain might carry different connotations depending on the port, era. Over time, these shifts built entire myths from fragments, yet the skeptic's strongest argument is also the simplest. Nostradamus's verses almost never mention names, dates, or verifiable details. When they do, they often miss the mark. His so-called accuracy depends entirely on the reader's willingness to bend the meaning until it fits. Still, even the critics can't dismiss his influence. The fact that his words endure discussed, debated, feared, suggests a deeper human need at play. We might not believe he foresaw our world, but we can't quite let go of the possibility either. Perhaps that is the genius of Nostradamus. He did not predict the future. He predicted our obsession with trying to dote. Behind the veil of prophecy, Nostradamus saw himself less as a magician and more as a researcher. In his era, astrology was not fantasy. It was a respected branch of natural philosophy, woven into medicine and politics alike. Doctors studied the stars to decide when to perform surgeries. Kings consulted astrologers before wars. For Nostradamus, reading celestial movements was not mystical indulgence, but data analysis in the language of his time. He charted planetary alignments, eclipses, and comets, believing that cosmic cycles mirrored human cycles. History, to him, was not random. It moved like the heavens, repeating in rhythms of fortune and disaster. By observing those rhythms, he thought one could infer what might return. That is why many of his quatrains sound like reflections of the past disguised as glimpses of the future. He was not seeing what would be. He was recognizing what always had been. Nostradamus also drew from classical sources, Ptolemy, Pliny, and the medieval texts of Arabic scholars who fused astronomy with mysticism. He blended their logic with his own observations, filtering it through poetic language that turned astronomy into allegory. A solar eclipse might become the king's shadow, swallowing the light. Mars in retrograde could mean bloodshed or conflict. In modern eyes, this may look like superstition, but in the 1500s, it was an attempt to make sense of chaos with the best tools available. The plague, famine, war all seemed to follow invisible laws. If the stars could predict the tides, why not human fate? So when Nostradamus looked up at the night sky, he was not merely seeking visions, He was mapping a pattern, trying to turn mystery into method and fear into something that could be measured. His prophecies may not have been scientific truth, but they were, in their own way, an early form of data-driven storytelling. Despite his reputation, Nostradamus never truly claimed to possess supernatural powers. In his own writings, he often called himself an interpreter of signs, not their creator. He saw patterns, possibilities, and probabilities, not absolute fates. But once Les Prophéties caught fire, that nuance vanished. The world wanted a prophet, not a philosopher. Letters from his later years show a man caught between fascination and fear. He was invited to royal courts, praised by nobles, yet also watched closely by the church. To survive, he played his role carefully, sometimes leaning into the aura of mystery, sometimes retreating behind humility. He described his insights as products of long study and meditation, guided by divine inspiration but grounded in reason. It was a delicate balance, sound too mystical, and he risked heresy, sound too rational, and he lost the magic that made him famous. The public did not care about balance. They wanted certainty. To them, Nostradamus was not a scholar reading cycles. He was a messenger from beyond time, and so the legend hardened around him. Every new war or disaster became proof of his gift. His name started appearing in pamphlets and street gossip, twisted to serve political or religious causes. He had become both revered and trapped by his own creation. The more he tried to explain, the less people listened. His poetry had escaped him, turning into something larger, an oracle that spoke for everyone except its author. In the end, Nostradamus seemed resigned to that role. He wrote his later predictions with a weary tone, aware that people would twist them anyway. Perhaps he understood the irony that the true prophecy was not about the events he described, but about humanity's endless need to believe that someone, somewhere, has already seen what is coming. Long after Nostradamus's death in 1566, his verses refused to die with him. Each century revived them in its own way, moulding his words to fit its fears. During the Enlightenment, skeptics mocked him but still quoted him. During revolutions, rebels and monarchists alike claimed his support. During wartime, his lines were printed in newspapers, twisted into either warnings or proof of destiny. He became the one voice that could belong to everyone because it never clearly belonged to anyone. In the 20th century, Nostradamus made the leap from dusty parchment to mass media. His quatrains were translated, dramatized, and broadcast on radio and television. Publishers re-released Les Prophéties whenever the world seemed near collapse. World wars, economic crashes, even the turn of the millennium. Each generation found itself reflected in his words, as though he had quietly written them anew. The 9/11 attacks, the COVID-19 pandemic, political assassinations all pulled him back into headlines. Even if scholars dismissed the connections, people kept looking. The fascination says something about the emotional power of uncertainty. Prophecy offers structure where life offers chaos. Nostradamus's poems, rich in fire, blood, and celestial signs, feel like miniature dramas of control. Reading him is an act of defiance against helplessness. That may be why he endures not just in books, but in pop culture, films, documentaries, video games, even conspiracy forums still invoke his name. He has become shorthand for mystery itself. What is striking is how his image has split. To some, he is the wise seer who foresaw Hitler, nuclear war, and climate disaster. To others, he is the archetype of pseudo-science, the clever charlatan whose brilliance lay in ambiguity, and yet both views coexist peacefully, as if they too were foretold. The man is less a historical figure now than a symbol, a mask humanity wears when staring at its own reflection in the dark. In the end, Nostradamus's true legacy might be this: he taught us that prophecy does not need to be accurate to feel real. It only needs to resonate. His words survive not because they tell the future, but because they keep reminding us how badly we want to know it. Even now, almost 5 centuries after his death, the argument over who Nostradamus truly was has not quieted. Historians read him as a product of his time, a man caught between medieval mysticism and the dawn of scientific thought. Believers call him a visionary whose mind could pierce the veil of time. Skeptics see him as a cunning writer who understood one timeless truth: people will always find prophecy where they wish to. His defenders often point to the uncanny resemblances between certain quatrains and real events: the Great Fire of London, the rise of Adolf Hitler, the fall of the Twin Towers. They insist these are not coincidences, but proof that Nostradamus possessed insight beyond reason. They cite the precision of his imagery: the great man struck down in the day by a thunderbolt, or 2 steel birds will fall from the sky. To them, his accuracy lies not in dates, but in patterns of catastrophe, a poetic rhythm that echoes through history. Critics counter that those accurate lines are misread, mistranslated, or even invented. Many of the most famous prophecies circulating online do not exist in the original French text. Nostradamus's true verses, they argue, are too fragmented to point clearly to any event. The connections are built afterward, a psychological trick rather than a supernatural one. When tragedy strikes, the human brain searches for meaning. Nostradamus simply left us a ready-made canvas for that search. Between these camps lies a quieter possibility. Maybe he was neither prophet nor fraud. Maybe he was a poet of uncertainty, someone who sensed that fear and curiosity are twin engines of civilization. His genius, then, was not in predicting events, but in predicting how people would react to them. He foresaw our hunger for narrative in chaos, our instinct to name the unknown. And so the debate continues, looping through generations, just as he once described the stars looping through the heavens. Whether genius or manipulator, scholar or showman, Nostradamus achieved what all visionaries crave: endurance. His words outlived their author, turning into something larger, a mirror in which every age sees the reflection it most needs to believe. Nostradamus's true legacy is not a list of fulfilled predictions. It is the psychological landscape he left behind. His verses still echo because they tap into something older than any prophecy: humanity's restless need to make the future feel less unknown. Every time disaster looms or the world shifts too fast, people return to him like sailors to a familiar constellation, searching for reassurance that none of this is random. He became, in a way, a storyteller of fate. His quatrains blur the line between history and imagination, offering structure to chaos without ever solving it. That is why they never age. They are elastic enough to stretch across centuries, to absorb every war, revolution, or pandemic that future generations endure. Each reader makes him new again, reinterpreting his coded lines to fit their moment. Nostradamus does not predict the world rewrites him endlessly. Modern psychology, might call this projection. Literature calls it endurance. His prophecies survive because they invite participation. They make the reader part of the mystery. That is why his influence reaches beyond religion or science into politics, art, pop culture, and even marketing. He represents the eternal dance between reason and belief, intellect and imagination. If you strip away the smoke and superstition, what remains is a man who tried to understand patterns, the rhythm of human behavior, the pulse of history repeating. In that sense, Nostradamus was both scientist and poet, one hand measuring the stars, the other writing in riddles about the heart. His words still work because we have not changed much. We still look upward, still fear what we can't predict, still want to believe that someone, somewhere, has already seen the ending. So whether you call him prophet, poet, or clever observer, Nostradamus's legacy stands as a mirror not of the future, but of us. His verses do not tell us what will happen. They show how deeply we want to know. And maybe that longing, not the accuracy of his visions, is the truest prophecy he ever made. And so, as the centuries roll on, Nostradamus remains exactly where he belongs, somewhere between the stars and the page, between the rational and the unknowable. His words have survived empires, revolutions, and every scientific age that tried to disprove him. Maybe that is the secret of his immortality. He never fought to be right, only to be remembered. When we read him today, we are not really searching for truth. We are tracing the outline of our own fears and hopes, disguised as prophecy. Nostradamus becomes less a man of the past and more a voice inside the present, whispering that the future has always been less about prediction and more about perception. Thank you for joining this journey through time and mystery. If you enjoy stories where history meets myth, where reason and wonder share the same candlelight, stay close. There are many more riddles waiting in the dark, and together we will keep listening for their echoes.